So why the heck does coolant come in so many different colors? Just on this bench, I have green, I have orange, I have gold, I have blue, I have pink, and I have purple. In addition to that, you don't want to confuse the gold with the yellow, even though the gold looks just like yellow coolant. So how the heck did we get here? 20, 30 years ago, automotive coolant was green, and that was it. Everybody used the exact same stuff, and at what point did it get to where we've got 8 or 10 different kinds of coolant out on the market? So that's what we're going to go over in this video. So how the heck did we get here? So most people think that coolant is simply just antifreeze. It keeps the water in the cooling system from freezing, and that's only a portion of what coolant actually has to do. So coolant needs to prevent freezing, prevent boiling, lubricate the water pump seals, and protect surfaces like iron, aluminum, steel, plastic, rubber, all of that stuff from corrosion. In addition to all of that, it also needs to be able to absorb heat and dissipate heat very, very quickly. So if the main jobs of coolant haven't changed over the past 30 years, why do I have 8 different types of coolant sitting here on the bench? Well, the engine's changed over the past 30 years. And in addition to that, the service intervals for coolant have gotten much, much longer. So older engines had much larger cooling passages, iron blocks, brass and copper radiators. And as engines evolved, manufacturers moved to aluminum heads, aluminum blocks, radiators made from aluminum and plastic, as well as smaller cooling passages to transfer heat quicker, water-cooled turbos, electric water pumps, on and on and on. So the coolant chemistry had to evolve because of all of that stuff. So almost all coolants start with the same base fluid, ethylene glycol. This base fluid is what gives your coolant freeze protection and what raises the boiling point. What's different about all these different coolants I have sitting here on the bench is going to be the additive packages of each one of these coolants. And the additive package is what provides corrosion protection for the engine and the cooling system itself. And the differences in chemistry is a different additive package. So when you start mixing all these different additive packages with one another, like if you were to mix the orange coolant with the old school green, like a lot of people found out in the 90s when they tried to top off their Dexcool systems with old school green, well, it will sludge up the system. Like you will get brown sludge throughout the entire cooling system, needing you to, flush the heater core, flush the radiator, or possibly even replace some of these items if they get, plugged up and damaged that badly due to incompatibility issues. So let's start out with the old school green stuff. This is probably what, the majority of you guys think about when you talk about coolant or antifreeze. This stuff has been around since the 1930s, and it was used in pretty much every vehicle up until about the mid-90s. And the old school green coolant is what is known as IAT, or inorganic additive technology. This stuff is designed for older engines and cooling systems. It uses phosphates and silicates to coat metal surfaces to prevent corrosion. The downside to this old school green coolant is the silicates are abrasive, and over time that can start to wear out seals, and if the cooling system is not serviced like it should be, or as much as it should be, the silicates tend to fall out and solidify in different parts of the cooling system. So this is why a lot of older vehicles needed a coolant flush every 3 years, 36,000 miles. It's because of these silicates falling out of suspension. The thing is, when these manufacturers started moving to engines with aluminum construction, they created smaller cooling passages that would absorb and dissipate heat much, much more quickly. And the thing is, with these smaller passages, well, these silicates that are in this old school green coolant will plug up these smaller passages. So things like oil coolers, stuff like that, will get plugged up with the silicates in this old school green coolant. The last thing worth noting about the old school green coolant is the last vehicle that I am aware of that has used old school green coolant as factory fill is now over 25 years old. So honestly, you should only be using this stuff in antique vehicles at this point. Anything over 25 years is typically what most states consider to be an antique. Now, in the mid-90s, GM came out with the first extended life coolant known as Dex-Cool, commonly known by its orange color. So this OAT coolant is organic acid technology, whereas the green coolant was IAT, inorganic acid technology. Now, what this orange coolant does is it uses organic acids to prevent corrosion. So there's no silicates or phosphates in this coolant, which gives it a much longer service interval than the old green stuff. Now, early versions of Dexcool use something called ethyl hexanoic acid. This acid is what gave Dexcool its corrosion protection, and this also just happened to be what ate up every single plastic and rubber part in a cooling system of a GM engine in the 90s. Modern versions of Dexcool use an alternative organic acid, and they are tested for plastic and rubber compatibility. Since 90s GM Dexcool engines were so efficient at self-flushing, people who didn't realize that the chemistry was different topped off their leaking cooling systems with the old school green IAT coolant, which then caused the entire cooling system to fill up with brown sludge. This situation gave Dexcool a horrible reputation in the late 90s and early 2000s, only some of which it actually deserved because, well, most of the issues were caused by people that topped it up wrong. But it did, the early versions did eat up a lot of gaskets. Now, the reason a lot of these OAT coolants like Dexcool that we're going to talk about here in a second work so well comes down to their corrosion protection. And the best analogy that I can give you as far as how these coolants work at preventing corrosion is undercoating your car. So let's say I give you a fixed amount of undercoating to treat your car with to keep it from rusting. Let's say I hand you a gallon. You need to make that gallon of undercoating last as long as possible to keep your car from rusting. The old green IAT coolant would be like using the entire gallon all at once to spray the entirety of the bottom of your car. The OAT coolants like Dex-Cool and some of these other ones we're going to talk about here are like spot treating areas that the rust starts to appear. So as that area starts to rust, you would just treat the area that the rust forms, and then you hold on to the rest of that gallon. This is how all these OAT coolants are able to last so much longer, is because they only treat the areas of the cooling system where rust has appeared. So this is why you'll see initially a lot of these different coolants will have like a 5 or 10 year initial service. And then some of them after the initial service, after some corrosion has developed in the cooling system, you'll see like the gold stuff that Ford and Chrysler used. The initial service was 5 years. And then after that, because some rust had developed in the cooling system, the service interval went down to 3 years. So this is how a lot of these coolants are able to last so much longer than the old school green stuff, is they're only using the additive to treat the areas that the rust has or corrosion has developed. So because of that, you're spot treating the areas, and when you do that, well, the additive package just lasts much longer in general. Now, because of GM's issues with Dexcool, other manufacturers took a slightly different approach. Ford, Chrysler, and a few other European manufacturers, rather than jumping all in on organic acid technology coolant like GM did, these other manufacturers went to what is called HOAT, or hybrid organic acid technology. This is the gold coolant that was introduced in the early 2000s. This is what Ford used for quite a few years. Chrysler used it for quite a few years. It's still in service. There's still quite a few vehicles that use this stuff, but it's, for lack of a better way of explaining it, it's basically like you combined the technology and the corrosion protection from OAT, Dex-Cool, and some of the silicates that you would see with the green coolant. This gave a slightly longer service interval, and it didn't have the gasket problems like full-blown OAT did back in the early 2000s. But because of this, like I said, this coolant still contains silicates that like to fall out over time, and again would cause certain areas of the cooling system to plug up. So if you guys start looking at 6-liter Power Strokes, for example, This is the coolant that they used in the 6-liter Power Strokes, and well, this is probably one of the big factors that led to so many oil cooler failures in those trucks in the early 2000s. Now, the Japanese took a more focused approach to coolant because, well, they were developing mostly 4- and 6-cylinder all aluminum engines. So they developed a coolant that is specifically designed to work well with aluminum. Asian vehicles use a phosphate organic acid coolant. These coolants have extremely long service intervals, but they do not tolerate hard water. If you top up one of these systems that use this phosphate organic acid coolant, over time you can have scale build up in the cooling system, which then would restrict the flow, reduce the cooling capacity, yada, yada, yada. The other thing that you need to note is just because I have, blue coolant here, there are manufacturers, I know like Toyota uses a pink version of this coolant. What you need to understand is the color of the coolant does not tell you what the chemistry is. So just because you have 2 blue coolants does not mean that they are identical. For example, another one here is a pink coolant that the Europeans use. Well, this pink European coolant is not compatible with the pink Asian coolant. So this is why, like what I was saying, just because they match in color does not mean they match in chemistry. The color that you see is nothing more than dye. There is no color standard for an IAT, OAT, or HOAT, and so on. You can have 2 pink coolants that are completely incompatible. Now, modern European vehicles use what is called SI-OAT, or silicated organic acid technology. These coolants use stabilized silicates, kind of like the old school green, that combine with the organic acids, again, kind of similar to what we saw in the gold coolant, but the pink coolant that the Europeans use is much less likely to have the silicates fall out of suspension. It works really well for turbocharging, electric water pumps, extremely small cooling passages, as you would imagine, high performance engines like the Europeans like to produce. So the last 2 coolants I have here is going to be the purple coolant from Chrysler and the yellow coolant from Ford. And the purple coolant from Chrysler, everything that I can find about it, it's extremely similar to GM's Dexcool. It is an organic acid technology coolant. There is no silicates, no phosphates, just like Dexcool. But honestly, as far as chemistry is concerned between the 2 coolants, they appear to be very, very similar, but under no circumstance would I ever try to mix them. It's just, you're playing Russian roulette with your cooling system if you mix any one of these with one another. The final one I want to talk about here is going to be the Ford Yellow. So the Ford Yellow, I believe, came out in like 2018, and this is a OAT coolant with phosphates. So this is very, very similar on paper to the blue Asian coolant or the pink Asian coolant, what Toyota and Honda tend to use. Seems to work very, very well. Ford actually, for a time, actually spec'd out an orange coolant from 2011 to 2017. Ford used an orange coolant that was essentially Dex-Cool. Since 2018, Ford has moved to the yellow coolant, which they say is backwards compatible. Now, the other thing worth talking about here is universal coolants. What about that all makes, all model stuff that you see that a lot of people top off with? These are OAT compromise formulas. They're designed to meet the minimum requirements across a lot of different chemistries. If you fully flush a system and you start from scratch with that universal coolant, they can work okay. The trouble is when you top off an unknown system with universal coolant, well, you may have good results or you may not. It just depends. You're literally rolling the dice with chemistry. So what coolant should you use in your vehicle? Well, use the stuff that the manufacturer tells you to use. Now, what you can do is if you do want to change for some reason, if you completely flush out the system and then change it over to another type of coolant, yes, you can do that. But where you run into problems is where you try to mix one with the other. That typically does not work. Just to give you guys a real world example, So my Mustang is a 2001 Ford, so it had a factory fill of the green coolant. Well, in 2003, Ford went to gold coolant. There are no changes between a 2001 Mustang and a 2003 Mustang. They had the exact same engine, radiator, hoses, etc. So I was able to flush out my system and change it over to the gold coolant, which in theory should last a little bit longer. And I've had absolutely zero issues with that. If you guys want further evidence, you could buy a Crown Vic in 1992 with green coolant. You could buy a Crown Vic in 2003 with gold coolant. And you could buy a Crown Vic in 2011 with orange coolant, all from Ford. And honestly, if you're doing a complete flush and get 100% of the old coolant out of the system, yes, you can change over. But you need to be very, very careful doing this to make sure that the cooling system is 100% cleaned out. So guys, I will have links down in the description to all the different coolants I feature here if you guys need to buy some coolant for your vehicle. As always, guys, if you guys like the video, hit like. If you want to see more content, go down and hit subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys.